When the Neo Geo Pocket released in 1998 in Japan, it was marketed as more of a mature handheld console, and its demographics seemed to be more towards teenage boys. At least that's how the commercials would make it appear as.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
Regarding this commercial, it was pretty rare to have a Japanese ad talk shit directly to their competition when it came to video games. Which, if it wasn't clear, was the Game Boy. I think whoever did the marketing for the Neo Geo assumed it would be wise to just go after the Game Boy audience, since an outsider of that group would assume it was mostly for very young children. I'm sure that wasn't wrong because that's who mostly used the console, but adults were all about the Game Boy 2 in Japan, with games like Tetris and Picross being so popular. In these ads, you'd think this would be the perfect time to try and capture a female demographic, but no, they show a girl for like barely a second in these ads. Another area the Game Boy surpassed their competition with, since games like Pokemon made the Game Boy explode in popularity with boys and girls. The Neo Geo did have games marketed towards girls, but I don't think they tried too hard in comparison. Even if Pokemon wasn't a factor, would Melon-chan's growth diary really have helped SNK? The Neo Geo Pocket released a variety of genres like sports, puzzle, gambling, and for the sake of this video, fighters. That being said, this black and white version of the handheld only lasted for like a year until it was phased out for an upgraded model we'll discuss later. So there were only 9 games released, 2 of which were fighters. Those fighters being King of Fighters R-1 and Samurai Spirits / Showdown ! That exclamation point is actually part of the official title. With both of these fighters, they were actually demade versions of existing titles, being KOF 97 and Samurai Showdown 4 respectively. These games were leagues better than any fighter on the Game Boy, period. Even though these games were pretty sparse in terms of content, these games were a blast and probably the best way to play a fighting game on a handheld at that time. Just standing still shows how fluid these idle animations are compared to anything on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color could offer. I think it also helps these games weren't trying to emulate the console or arcade versions of these games. If you look at Samurai Showdown for the Game Boy, that's trying to be like a lesser version of the arcade game. Almost all of these fighters on the console had a chibi style, which I think helped separate these games as their own thing. Sure, they have familiar elements from those arcade games like similar stages, characters, and plot. But these games' art style kinda set the tone that these are like simpler versions with their own game feel to them. The Neo Geo Pocket, from my knowledge, was slightly more powerful than a Game Boy, and perhaps even the Game Boy Color, and it shows with these games. These titles also nailed down the most important aspect, and that was the feel and control you have in gameplay. These games aren't as fast as their arcade counterparts, but they still had a good respectable speed that didn't make you think you were playing underwater like so many Game Boy fighters do. You could even pull off quarter circle motions with ease thanks to how well the Neo Geo Pocket feels. This little clicky stick on its own is probably the best part and most defining aspect of the Neo Geo Pocket. This clicky thumbstick is perfect and emulates a Neo Geo console controller perfectly, since that also had the clicky stick. So doing Hadokens and Shoryuken motions are a breeze here and feel better to do than a lot of consoles did. The button layout is similar to the Game Boy on how one button is raised above the other for comfortability, but the A and B buttons placement are swapped on the Neo Geo Pocket. If you're used to the Game Boy layout, it may take you a second to realize the button to cancel out of menus is on the top this time. These two fighters, and the ones that came out after, had to be more creative when being limited to just having 2 buttons. If you hold a button, that's your hard hit, whereas quickly tapping is the faster, weaker hit. This also applies to when you perform special moves as well. Street Fighter II on the original Game Boy did a similar setup to this a few years prior. Looking back at the handheld, the start button is just an options button, which, like the dedicated power button, is all rubbery, which isn't very satisfying to push since I always feel like I gotta push extra hard to make sure the input actually goes through. I'm sure I don't actually have to do that, but with the cheap feeling of the rubbery buttons, I just can't help myself. I guess a positive of having this for the power button is that it makes it harder to accidentally push the power button during play. In addition, they can keep the top portion buttonless there since your index fingers will most likely rest there. I will say that the speaker is kinda pathetic. Since it's so tiny, the sounds are very compressed even at max volume, and I think SNK knew this since most music in all games are very boopy, so it stands out a bit more if you're like in a loud area or you're trying to listen. Thankfully, there is a headphone jack, so this can become a non-issue. Luckily, the music and sound effects don't feel too harsh on your ears if you crank it on the headphones. This handheld feels good in the hands too. Dare I say, better than the Game Boy. We got this little groove here where most likely your pinkies are gonna sit, and mentioned earlier, your index fingers will mostly rest on top, giving a better grip on the handheld, so it adds a slight bit of that comfortability since they went for a more horizontal approach than the Game Boy's vertical one. To me, it's more comfortable since your hands are gonna be further apart and they're not all mashed in like when playing a Game Boy. This is coming from someone who doesn't have the biggest hands, so perhaps someone with huge hands would wildly disagree. Just the look of it comes off as more premium than the Game Boy consoles. Yes, both of these are made of plastic, but the Neo Geo Pocket just comes off as more sleek and clean, looking relatively glossy without leaving any fingerprint marks. I think this is because the Game Boy is just a bit grainier in its plastic, whereas the Neo Geo just has a smoother finish. Perhaps the colors of the consoles help sell that look too, but that's just my conjecture. The Pocket even had a similar price to the Game Boy Color in Japan, so just at a glance, the Pocket would probably look more appealing, at least on the surface. The Neo Geo Pocket had a slightly different approach on how it handled batteries. It used 2 AAA batteries opposed to the Game Boy Color needing 2 AA batteries. It even allegedly lasted 4 times longer than a Game Boy Color did, only lasting 10 hours. How the Neo Geo Pocket did this is through a little help of its backup battery being a lithium CR2032. At the time, this is a battery you'd find in like an electronic watch or the Dreamcast VMU or something. This battery was essential for part of the system's memory and its internal clock. If it died, that part of the system's memory is gone. Your save data on the games is safe though, since that's saved on the game's cartridge itself. Just like the info in your settings, your calendar or alarm would be wiped, which I don't know if a lot of people use anyways, but it's cool you can at least do something without a game. That's more than you can say for the Game Boy. I wonder if there's someone in this planet that just had to check the horoscope on the Neo Geo Pocket every day. You can still play games without this battery, so no worries if you can't find one, but you're just gonna get this annoying prompt every time you boot it up. This particular version of the Pocket's lifespan, however, was only 1 year in Japan, since SNK released an upgraded version being the Neo Geo Pocket Color in 1999. This is when the handheld finally released in European and North American regions, making the Pocket not just some niche Japan-only thing. This was smart to wait to release the upgraded color version in these regions so consumers wouldn't be confused between the 2 versions or have to deal with which Neo Geo Color games would work on the non-color handheld since not all of them were forward compatible. The color version was slightly bigger than the original Neo Geo Pocket, but still felt comfortable in the hands by adding some grooves on the side where your fingers kinda get locked in. But the main upgrade here was obviously the ability to display colors. Gone was the need for the contrast dial on the previous handheld. This screen still needed to be played in a lit area for the game to be seen, and the color went a long way with actually making seeing the game easier by a little bit. The Game Boy Color had a much bigger palette of colors available, but they weren't able to be used all at once. The Neo Geo Pocket had a smaller palette of colors, but could display more colors at once, making it seem brighter and more colorful than the Game Boy Color. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was shaping up to being a worthy rival to the Game Boy for its global release. Previous companies that tried to take on the Game Boy, like Sega's Game Gear or Atari's Lynx, went with the approach of making the console itself better than the Game Boy in every way by having a color screen that was also backlit using a more powerful console that produced better sounds and graphics. On paper, sounds like it would destroy the Game Boy, but all of those additions came at a cost, making those handhelds more expensive compared to the Game Boy, and it just took way more batteries, which just added to the cost in the long term. Even with all that, their battery life didn't even last longer than the Game Boy's. The Neo Geo Pocket Color improved on the Game Boy in ways that kept it cheap and didn't affect its battery life either. So, with it being more powerful than a Game Boy, with longer battery life, better feeling controls, and even had no region locking, this was shaping up to be a long-lasting console for SNK that could have taken a good portion of the handheld gaming market from Nintendo, making them worthy competition. So what happened? Yeah, this console only lasted a little over a year in the States. This can mostly be blamed on the extremely poor marketing, or lack thereof. It's not like this commercial is bad or anything, it's just kinda run-of-the-mill. Like, they are showing great games, but they could show a bit more variety here, not Sonic going through a loop again. He doesn't even go through it. But again, the problem isn't the commercial, but the fact it wasn't shown enough. As a kid, I never saw this advert, and I was on Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network like crazy, so you'd think I'd see it at least once. I never saw it in my gaming magazines, and I never even saw it in stores. Why didn't I see it in stores is because for a period of time, this console was only purchasable in North America through the website eToys. You know, eToys! The internet was being used to buy stuff in 1999, but it wasn't all that mainstream quite yet. This kinda ruined the launch right off the bat. This package available was an insane deal too. It was $70 and had the 6 launch games packed in, even the batteries were included. Those pack-in games being Pac-Man, Neo Turf Masters, Metal Slug First Mission, Fatal Fury First Contact, and sequels to games we talked about earlier being KOF R-2 and Samurai Showdown! 2. Don't forget that exclamation point. This bundle is what I got as a kid for my birthday. Allegedly, my parents got this at a Walmart, which I never saw myself there. The Neo Geo Pocket, closer to the holiday season, did become available in stores like Walmart and Target, but I feel that really hurt any good press this could have gotten by having it not launch in a brick-and-mortar store. I never even saw the games themselves separately sold in any store. The only additional game I got was SNK Vs Capcom Match of the Millennium, since my friend just straight up gave me her loose copy. A reason this console's marketing was so sparse is because since SNK was going through some hard financial times, they got bought out by a company called Aruze, and Aruze really didn't give a shit about its video game division. They were all about the pachinko and slots. Aruze wasn't interested in making a true effort and competing with the Game Boy. Despite the fact, the Neo Geo Pocket Color did make a profit. I'm sure SNK knew it wasn't gonna take a huge chunk of the market here, but if they stuck around, I think it could have grown a bit more. Another issue is that there wasn't a crazy amount of third-party support here. Sure, you had your Pac-Man, Mega Man, and Sonic, but there wasn't that much beyond that in terms of big-named IPs. SNK themselves made a majority of the games here, and it certainly shows. While there's nothing wrong with that, you gotta have more variety than just your company's IPs to propel your console. Let's actually talk about some of these games, and I'm gonna look exclusively at the fighters since this is a fighting game channel after all. This console is mostly defined by its fighters anyways, and almost seemed built that way with fighters in mind. I keep hearing people and other content creators say that most of the games on this console were fighters, and I wish this were true, but sadly it's not. Including the 2 non-color games, there are a total of 9 fighters for this console. There's far more gambling games on this console than fighters. I wonder how that happened. The 9 fighters being KOF R-1 and 2, the first Samurai Showdown! And 2, Fatal Fury First Contact, Big Bang Pro Wrestling, SNK Gal Fighters, The Last Blade, and SNK Vs Capcom. Also, don't say Mega Man the Power Fighters, that is not a fighting game. You can't fight a human opponent, and you're mostly shooting bosses in what is essentially a boss rush game, but that's a discussion for another time. Anyways, let's actually talk about these games. King of Fighters R2 being the sequel to the Neo Geo Pocket launch game we discussed earlier, this game being a demake based off of KOF 98, since the stages are pulled right from there, as well as Rugal being the final boss. This game has way more content than its previous iteration, which just had an arcade mode and a local versus. We finally got a training mode here, as well as a mode called Making Mode. Making Mode has you rename one of the characters on the roster as something else to, I suppose, pretend it's an original character, or you. Guess you gotta use your imagination a bit. This is kinda where I see some of the translation is a bit spotty, like having the word kill instead of erase, since this is just for save data. This mode has you equipping things to tweak with stats and puts you in a plot where you're fighting who you need to pretend are Rugel's goons in various scenarios, a perfect mode for a handheld game. Again, use your imagination. That being said, once you pick your character, that's who you are for the whole game. You need to kill your character and start over to change who you want to play as. Another sequel to a game we briefly discussed being Samurai Showdown! 2. Look up any official listing for this game and I swear that exclamation point will be there, I'm not crazy. This game is based on Samurai Showdown 64, Warrior's Rage, which despite the title is not an N64 game but an arcade game. This title is a 2D game, however, opposed to Sam Show 64's 3D style. This game feels fantastic and puts the Game Boy Sam Show to shame. That being said, not a whole lot of modes in this game. You have arcade and survival mode. You can also collect cards to increase and change stats and use them in a link cable battle with friends, but I doubt many people did this. This game came out only 3 months after KOF R-2, so you'd think it would have taken some notes on its single player modes, but I suppose not. Next is Fatal Fury First Contact, another remake of an existing game being Real Bout Fatal Fury 2. Depressingly, this game has no content beyond arcade mode. There are 2 unlockable characters, being Alfred and Lau, who is a random background character who got beat up in the intro of Mark the Wolves and the arcade version of Real Bout 2, making this his biggest appearance ever. Next up is SNK Gal Fighters, one of my personal favorites. This game I feel like was SNK trying to market their stuff towards more of a female audience, and I don't think a lot of people took the bait on that. This game had an extremely limited release in the US, and because of that, it's mega rare. This game is very charming, and the sprites here are reused from past games, but they have a lot more cutesy and goofy animations this time around. This game in terms of modes is a bit lacking as well, sadly. We got an arcade mode with some goofy endings, and beating the game can gain you items that can be used in arcade mode or local versus that can yet again change stats and abilities in a match. Some items don't even have a full explanation of what they do or just do nothing as far as I know. There is a training mode which is always nice, and we have 3 secret characters to unlock as well. We have Whip, who is a KOF mainstay, Yuki, Kyo's girlfriend, making her one and only playable appearance. The final boss of this game is Miss X, which is just Iori in disguise, and this wouldn't be the final appearance of this Miss X alter ego either. Last Blade is one of the best games on the handheld in my opinion. This was one of the last fighters SNK produced on the platform, and it seems like they were able to take more advantage of the hardware in this later stage of the handheld. The sprite work seems to have a big improvement over past games, and even the stages have a bit of animation to them that's very impressive. My favorite are the stage intros, which emulates how it was in the arcade release. Something I'd wish we'd see more of in fighters in general, to be honest. This game has far more content than all the other fighters we went over. The story mode is a combination of the Last Blade 1 and 2, and once you clear the game with a character who is in both games, you can play the second part to their story. If you want to go back and play their Last Blade 1 story, you just hit the start button when selecting them in the story mode. We also have a survival and training mode, as well as time attack. Although in training mode, you can't choose the stage you want, like in past fighters we discussed, it's just random. That's a bit of a shame. Time attack works kinda differently than it traditionally would, being just an arcade mode that's time. This time attack, you have to take out as many enemies as possible in quick succession with infinite health, and defeat as many enemies as you can within the time limit. Which is pretty fun since the enemies do come in pretty fast. Very impressive for this game. Their survival mode is thankfully more thought out than most by having you gamble the in-game currency by completing a certain in-game task in your next fight. Speaking of the in-game currency, you can spend it on character profiles, endings, and secret characters, which in this game there are 7. You can also buy 2 minigames that are super fun. Unlocking these minigames is a huge pain though, since you have to rack up to 4 hours of playtime. You can't just chill in the menus and in training mode either. It has to be active battles to count towards the time. If I was a kid with infinite time, these would be nice things to come across to make the game feel fresh, but as an adult, that's not an easy task. If doing this requires me to buy new batteries, does that mean these minigames are paid DLC? Big Bang Pro Wrestling is the only game I never played prior to working on this video, and I'm not much of a wrestling game gal, but this game is pretty solid. The presentation of the pre-fight matches are very impressive and these sprites are beautiful. Oh wait. Jokes aside, the pared down gameplay sprites are still impressive and the animations are so smooth. Maybe the best I've seen on the console. The controls here are interesting since each button does 2 very different types of moves. The B button up close to your opponent grapples them, which pinning them down is how you win, but if you have some distance with your opponent, you'll do a taunt. The A button, if you don't hit any directional buttons, are for your strikes, but holding a direction while pressing A has your character perform a roll if you need to move fast. This game has some pretty decent content. You can do a single CPU battle or a tournament bracket if you choose. There's also a story mode here, which is pretty well done and sets the mood of a proper wrestling exhibition, at least at that time. The roster is, from my knowledge, all original characters created by SNK. They could be based on real wrestlers, but I cannot personally confirm that, although this guy is giving me T-Zoc vibes. Now, I saved probably the most well-known game for last, being the crown jewel of the library, at least in my opinion, being SNK Vs Capcom Match of the Millennium. And this game truly has it all. A proper training mode where you can pick the stage, an arcade mode where you have the option to make it a 3-character team like KOF, or a tag game, or a single fighter one with multiple rounds. The story is pretty fun too, since every single character has their own rival and has either Geese or M. Bison trying to eliminate them from the tournament while you uncover their secret plot. When you beat the game multiple times, you can clearly see the pattern of the story mode, since it really hits the same plot beats for every character, but the charm of the story mode is just too powerful for me to care. This game, out of all of the Capcom vs SNK crossover fighters, probably has the most in-depth plot that's actually represented in the game, so take that for what you will. I will gripe that unlocking these characters takes far too long, since depending on the difficulty you choose, when you beat arcade mode, you get rid of the blocks that are covering up a silhouette for the character you're gonna get. This would be fine if it wasn't random or they didn't get rid of the spots you already unlocked, making this process take far longer than it should. We also have an entry mode, which makes it so you can save specific teams and even create your own win quote to whatever you want. Olympic mode is honestly where I spent most of my time with this game though. Once you go into the mode, you're given a choice between Team SNK with Renamaru or Team Capcom with Karen. Whichever team you pick for certain sub-games, you can only pick characters from that company. For example, if you pick SNK when you play the survival mode, you can only pick SNK characters and just fight Capcom characters as your opponents. Both teams have 3 of the same modes, being Survival, which really is like a Kumite, and you have to beat 100 enemies. Time Attack, where you just do 5 one-round fights and see how fast you can beat your opponents despite you having infinite health. And First Attack, where it's kind of like a Bushido Blade style. You just have to be the first to land a hit before your opponent out of 10 matches. Not a bad mode if you want to get better at first attacks in this game. A cute little Easter egg with the records mode is if you get a high score for Ryu, there's a little reference to Ryu's ending in Street Fighter 2 where he doesn't stand on the podium for his awards ceremony. Each team does have 2 unique minigames, which is the real meat of this mode. SNK has a metal slug shooter called Target 9 that's more of a reflex test, and you have to shoot Mars people and their UFOs and keep track of your bullets by reloading with the B button. Shooting down the pink Mars people grants health, which I feel like it takes a bit for any enemies to hit you, so the pink Mars people I feel should have been a bit more rare to make it more challenging. The next minigame is called Blade Arts with a Samurai Showdown theme. You play as Jubei and cut down as many strawman dummies as you can. Kind of a reaction or a reflex minigame. I love this one, but it lasts so long and I feel like Miss Hitch should reduce the time or something. One weird thing here is that you cannot pause in any of these games in Olympic mode. If you hit pause, you immediately quit the game and get scolded by your respective team manager. Perhaps they thought you cheat by pausing, but I mean, like, just black out the screen when you pause if that was the concern. On the Capcom side for minigames, we got Ghost Trick, which is a Ghosts and Goblins minigame that I guess is like a pared down version of Frogger, where you gotta go back and forth on the screen without Firebrand hitting you. Little side note, but this one and only Firebrand appearance was enough for SNK to put him on the box of the Switch re-release, which is interesting. Maybe the artist just likes Firebrand. This minigame to me was strangely addictive and is probably what I played most on here. My favorite though was Catwalk. This is a rhythm minigame where you dance as Felicia, and we only got 6 songs here, but I think it offers a very worthwhile challenge. Oh hey, there's Lord Raptor. That being said, if you mess up a couple of times, you get booted out of the minigame right away. If you know what you're doing with these songs though, this is a great way to rack up versus points. Oh, I should probably explain versus points. Versus points are the in-game currency, not for unlocking characters disappointingly, but for the character's 3rd super move, which is an odd unlock to say the least. So every single character's 3rd super is locked. Doesn't that just sound weird? Also, unlocking every single super move is gonna take you a long ass time since they don't give out a lot of versus points even if you get a gold medal ranking on all of these modes. And it also doesn't help that the Olympic mode is the only way to unlock versus points as well. Kinda wish it was colors as an unlock instead, or really just nothing at all, and just have the characters have access to their 3rd supers. Bit of a knock against this game. That aside, this game is my favorite of the bunch, with Last Blade coming in 2nd. And there really isn't a single bad fighter here. Sure, the original KOF and Sam Show games on the non-color Neo Geo are probably the least best by default, but they're still solid titles and better than probably any portable fighter at that time. Something about all of these games that I'm sure a lot of people noticed was its spotty translation. Really, it's not that bad, but every now and then, there'll be a phrase or two that might have you raise an eyebrow. We talked about the games, but what about the boxes that hold them? If you lived in PAL regions or Japan, then these games got the respect they deserve by having them in a plastic snap case. Even the game cartridge has another case in it for extra protection, which is better than any other handheld game packaging at that time. In North America regions, it was in a cardboard box. Nintendo did this with their Game Boy releases and beyond, which I didn't even like as a kid. As someone who collects games, I don't want to keep this flimsy, easily destroyed cardboard in my collection. I'm assuming both SNK and Nintendo did this to save as much money as possible. If that's the case though, why only do that in North America? Did they have more confidence for the system in PAL regions, so they went the extra mile for them? Japan didn't always do the plastic snap cases either. Sometimes they did the cardboard boxes, and I don't know why they would flip-flop between the two. But if you're collecting any of these games, I highly recommend getting it anywhere but the NA regions if possible. Don't forget that the system is region-free. In regards to the box art themselves, almost all the games we talked about, for the most part, have a unified box art for all regions. A good amount of these games have a chibi art style on them, which is an honest depiction of how the game itself looks. A few exceptions being Big Bang Wrestling, which is fair since the game itself isn't a chibi style, and SNK Vs Capcom, which I'm assuming they wanted this game to look as cool and mature as possible, so maybe it got more attention. But that's just my personal theory. Some games even did both. 2 months after the Neo Geo Pocket Color came out in North America, Japan got a slightly slimmer redesign called the new Neo Geo Pocket Color, which released October 1999. Kind of odd this isn't the one that released in North America and PAL first. Perhaps in the middle of making the color pocket for those regions, they had just thought to do this redesign, and by then it was too late to push this design. Whatever the reason, I feel like they should have waited a bit. But I guess the pressure to hit that holiday season was on if we're being real here. Even if this was a design that came out in those regions first anyways, it's not like it would have saved the console. So this design is a bit smaller and feels lighter in the hands. The original non-color version is still the smallest of the three, but it's not in color, so who cares? The screen itself, I'm pretty sure, is the exact same size for all three. The button feel, that being said, is the exact same. One minor thing I feel like is improved is the battery cover. For the previous models, I feel after some wear on the plastic, it would break off for a lot of people. Kinda like the original Game Boys or Game Boy Advance. For the new Neo Geo Pocket, I feel like they somewhat improved that here. This console didn't have too many accessories, at least ones made by SNK themselves. Just touching on a couple notable ones, the first being the link cable. The link cable, I'm sure as you expected, is the only means to have other Neo Geo Pockets connect together in some way. In the case of every single game we talked about, you can do link battles with each other. I feel SNK tried to incentivize this more by having those stat-altering items in some of the games we discussed, so you can have a means to trade items and have an advantage over your opponent. It's kind of odd you can't turn off some of these advantages in-game, but I don't think SNK gave a shit about balancing these games seriously for competitive play. I guess whoever you play against, you'll just have to have a gentleman's agreement not to use item buffs. Another cable of note is the one that connects to the Sega Dreamcast. Not too many games supported this feature, and in terms of fighters, only 2 utilized it. SNK Vs Capcom, when connected to the Dreamcast, allowed you to send your Versus points earned from the Neo Geo Pocket game to the Dreamcast, the Dreamcast title being Capcom vs SNK 1. With the Versus points sent to the Dreamcast game, you could spend those points in their in-game shop instead. Both of these games gave these points at a very slow pace, so I guess it's a cool option to be able to earn them portably to use in the console game. Too bad it doesn't go the other way around. You don't go fully empty-handed in the Pocket game, however. You do get all the secret characters instantly, which I'm kinda split on, since earning the characters is part of the fun and makes you appreciate more who you slowly earn. But on the flip side, it's a really slow unlock system that can be frustrating since beating the game doesn't guarantee progress, as I mentioned earlier. This feature is removed in the updated version, Capcom vs SNK Pro on the Dreamcast, since everything is pretty much unlocked from the start in that version. The other game that has Dreamcast connectivity is King of Fighters R-2 with the Dreamcast game King of Fighters 99 Dream Match. Connecting is essentially just being able to trade points between each other, and sending points from the Pocket game to the console one just unlocks some pictures, and just 10 at that. So pretty boring. Sending points from console to the Pocket game will earn you skills for characters, so that's a bit more useful. That's it in terms of fighters that use this feature, which I feel wasn't implemented to its fullest. The Neo Geo Pocket was a great handheld system for me growing up, and something I always look back on fondly. Sure, the Game Boy was important to me too, but I mostly had third-party licensed garbage on there, whereas with the Neo Geo Pocket, I had real quality titles, which kinda cemented a solid identity for the handheld to me. Ironically, not having third-party shovelware probably hurt the Pocket in terms of sales, since it didn't look like it had a lot of variety in their library of known IPs, versus everything the Game Boy had in the eyes of an average consumer. Which, if we think for like a second, is mostly apparent. If they see a game like Barbie or Spider-Man for the Game Boy, that's probably gonna look like the better buy for their kids, since that same parent probably won't know what Fatal Fury or Metal Slug is. Thankfully though, the Neo Geo Pocket legacy does live on, be it excellent indie games like Pocket Rumble that emulate the Neo Geo Pocket style really great, or the 2 collections of Neo Geo Pocket games on the Switch and PC. These collections I've discussed before, but I highly recommend getting them both if you haven't already. The best feature in this compilation is being able to play local multiplayer in all titles. This collection acts as a great museum to the Neo Geo Pocket itself too, allowing you to use almost all versions and variants of the handheld as your border, in addition to being able to view the boxes as a 3D model and flip through all the manuals. It's one of my favorite collection titles for video games in general. Again, I can't recommend this enough. The version of the first volume on Steam, oddly enough, omits SNK Vs Capcom and gets rid of all Capcom branding from its logo art. SNK Vs Capcom is replaced by Crush Roller, and this is especially odd since Volume 2 has SNK Vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash with no issue. If you want to snag the original hardware for yourself, it can be quite pricey. Finding a Neo Geo Pocket, regardless of its variant as of now, isn't too crazy. Probably expect to go a bit above $100 for one in good condition. It's the games and accessories that become pricey. I do recommend getting a flash card that can store like 2 games at once. How you get those games to put in the flash card is none of my business. I do wish we lived in an alternative universe where the Neo Geo Pocket was a huge success, but I feel part of the charm of the system was that it was short-lived. If there was another Neo Geo Pocket, perhaps they just would have made direct ports of their arcade games and not done something unique with their games like they have with the Pocket. Looking at SNK's output on the GBA is probably something they would have done on the successor to the Pocket if given the chance. Not saying any of those games are bad, but they certainly don't have the charm of the fighters we just discussed. The Neo Geo Pocket may not have had a lot of fighters on the handheld, but it's certainly what defined it.